Sathyabama Institute of Science and Technology.
Hello all, welcome. This is VishnuPriya here, Assistant Professor, Sathyabama School of Physiotherapy, Sathyabama Institute of Science and Technology. This is my fourth lecture session about the articulations of the vertebral column. These are the contents that I will be discussing about. First, we will see about the different articulations which is present throughout the entire vertebral column. Then, along with that, we will see the intervertebral disc, and finally we will have a quick summary. As we all know, we have 33 vertebral bones. These 33 vertebral bones articulate with each other at multiple junctions. So, we have n number of vertebral joints. So, these are the joints. First, we have atlanto-occipital joint, then atlanto-axial joint, then intervertebral joint, then costovertebral joint, costotransverse joint, then lumbosacral joint, then sacroiliac joint and sacrococcygeal joints. These are the different articulations at different regions of the vertebral column. So, we are going to see one by one. The first joint is the atlanto-occipital joint. It is nothing but it is a junction between the occipital bone, which is the bone which is present at the base of the skull, and the first vertebral bone is the atlas. So, this junction we have occipital bone here. Occipital bone is most posterior part of the skull, and along with that the atlas, which is the first cervical vertebra which articulates these two bones together, forms the atlanto-occipital joint. Here we have the atlas bone, and this atlas articulates with the facets of the occipital bone. The articular facets of atlas articulate with the occipital condyle of the occipit bone. So, atlanto-occipital joint is generally a synovial joint, which is an ellipsoid variety, and we have the superior articular facet and inferior articular facets in each vertebral bone. So, here the superior articular facets of the atlas articulates with the occipital bone. These are the ligaments we have: nuchal ligament, alar ligament, apical ligaments of the dens, anterior atlanto-occipital ligament, posterior atlanto-occipital ligament and tectorial membrane. So, these are the different ligaments which is present at the atlanto-occipital joint. Next comes the blood supply. This joint receives the blood supply from the deep cervical, vertebral and occipital arteries. And next, the nerve supply. It receives the innervation from the anterior ramus of first cervical spinal nerve, that is from the C1. Then coming to the movements of atlanto-occipital joint, this joint has a limited movement which helps in the nodding of head, and also it assists in flexion and extension of the entire cervical region. Next, we will move on to the next joint, which is the atlanto-axial joint. It has two articulations. One is the median atlanto-axial joint, and it has two lateral joints, lateral atlanto-axial joints. So, here we have the atlanto-axial joint, where the dens or odontoid process of the axis articulates with the atlas bone, which forms the atlanto-axial joint. So, this atlanto-axial joint comes under the classification of synovial pivot variety, and the lateral atlanto-axial joint comes under plane variety. So, here we have the articular surfaces. At the medial atlanto-axial joint, we have the articular surface of dens, which articulates with the anterior arch of the atlas, and the lateral atlanto-axial joint has the inferior articular surface which articulates with the superior articular surface of the C2. Then we have the ligaments. These are the ligaments: anterior longitudinal ligament, L.O. ligament, cruciform ligament, tectorial membrane, alar ligament, apical ligament, accessory atlanto-axial ligament. These are the different ligaments that is present at the atlanto-axial joint. Then comes the blood supply. It receives blood supply from the deep cervical, vertebral and occipital arteries. Then we have the nerve supply from second cervical nerve. Then we have the movements of axial rotation. This atlantoaxial joint especially has the rotatory movements. So this is how the atlantoaxial joint has the rotatory movement. The dens of the axis articulates with the anterior arch of the atlas, which has the rotatory movements. Next we will move on to the next joint, which is the intervertebral joint. It has two subcategory under which the first one is the intra-articular disc or vertebral symphysis or interspinous joint. So this joint is nothing but it is the junction between the vertebral bodies. Between the vertebral bodies, it has an disc shaped structure called as intervertebral disc, and the next joint is the facet or the zygapophyseal joints. So these are the intervertebral joints. Each vertebra articulate with the adjacent vertebra through these two articulations. The first articulation is the interspinous joint, where we will have the intervertebral disc, and then another joint is the facet joint. In this, the articular facets articulate with each other. The first joint here we have the vertebral symphysis, which is the medial most joint where the vertebral bodies articulate with the adjacent vertebrae. So this intervertebral joints are having the intervertebral disc. So these are generally known as the cartilaginous joints. These type of joints have the limited mobility. The diameter of a disc usually corresponds to that of the adjacent vertebra. So the thickness of the disc increases towards the lumbar region. The intervertebral discs are thinner in the upper cervical region and it is thicker in the lumbar region. So here we could see the arrangement of intervertebral disc throughout the entire spine. So this intervertebral disc provides cushion and also it provides stability to the joints. Next we will see about the structure of the intervertebral disc. The intervertebral disc resembles a closed water-filled container made up of different types of tissues. So the intervertebral disc are composed of three main parts. The first one is the annulus fibrosus, the outer ring-shaped portion that is made up of fibrous connective tissue which surrounds the nucleus pulposus, and the next one is the nucleus pulposus. It is the innermost jelly-like structure which is the core structure of the intervertebral disc. Then we have the cartilaginous end plate. This cartilaginous end plates are nothing but it's the bony transition of the vertebral bodies to the intervertebral disc. So this is how the intervertebral disc looks like. So outer rim of structure is the annulus fibrosus and at the center we have the nucleus pulposus. The core structure is the nucleus pulposus, that is the jelly-like structure which is present in the center of the intervertebral disc. So here we have the intervertebral disc. At the core we have the nucleus pulposus and surrounded by the annulus fibrosus. Almost all the parts of the intervertebral disc are avascular and also do not receive any nerve supply. Except the outermost annulus fibrosus, nearly 70% of the annulus fibrosus receives no vascular supply. So usually the 30% receives the blood supply through the nutrient arteries from the vertebral end plates, and it also receives nerve supply from sinovertebral nerve, which is a recurrent meningeal branch of the spinal nerve. Next comes the functions of intervertebral disc. Mainly it is to endure a great amount of stress during locomotion. The intervertebral disc are the main shock absorbing structures and they all together provide a viscoelastic property. This characteristic allows adjusting to the various loads that the disc has to hold. It is a very strong structure that acts as a cushion. The intervertebral disc link and hold together all the vertebrae, and moreover the intervertebral disc prevents the adjacent vertebra friction against each other. They also helps in protecting the neurovascular structures. Next we'll see about the facet joint. Facet joints are nothing but they are the articulation between the articular processes of lamina and pedicel. So, here we have the facet joint which is having the articular facets of the adjacent vertebra. This facet joint is also known as zig apophyseal joint. It comes under the synovial variety and plane type of joint. The articular surfaces are the inferior articular facet of superior vertebra articulates with the superior articular facet of the inferior vertebra. And we have the ligaments like ligamentum flavum, posterior longitudinal ligament, interspinous ligament, supraspinous ligament, nuchal ligament. And we receive the blood supply from the posterior spinal branch of segmental spinal arteries, and also we receive the nerve supply from the medial branches of dorsal rami of spinal nerves. Then comes the movements of the facet joint. This facet joint has a very limited mobility. It helps in the intervertebral joint mobility, especially at the cervical spine. It facilitates flexion, extension, lateral flexion and rotation. And at the thoracic level, it restricts flexion, extension and permits rotation, and at the lumbar level, it provides limited flexion, extension and lateral flexion. These facet joints has a very limited mobility and it plays a very important role in maintaining the movements. So, this is how the facet joint moves. It has a very minimal movement like gliding and sliding. Then we'll move on to the next type of joint, costovertebral joint and costotransverse joint. These joints are especially present at the level of thoracic segment. So, first is the costovertebral joint. Costovertebral joints are nothing but the head of the rib articulates with the body of the vertebra. So, that is the costovertebral joint. Then we have the costotransverse joint, which means the body of the rib articulates with the transverse process of the vertebra. That is the costotransverse joint. So, this costovertebral and costotransverse joints are the plane variety of joints which has the articular surfaces are the costal demifacets of vertebra from T1 to T12 articulates with the heads of the ribs from 1 to 12. Then the costotransverse joint has the tubercle of rib which articulates with the transverse process of the adjacent vertebrae. The ligaments are the intra-articular ligaments, costotransverse ligament, superior costotransverse ligament and lateral costotransverse ligament. And this joint receives the nerve supply from lateral branches of posterior rami of C8 to T11 spinal nerves, and it receives the blood supply from the intercostal arteries. So, here the costocorporeal joint, which is the costovertebral joint, which has the internal rotation and elevation of the head of the rib. Next, costotransverse joint from 1 to 6 has the internal rotation of the neck of rib. Then the costotransverse joint from 7 to 10 has the posteromedial translation of the neck of rib. So, here we have the costovertebral joint. The head of the rib articulates with the costal facets or the demifacets of the vertebral body. Next, we will move on to the next joint variety, lumbosacral joint, which is nothing but it is the junction between the fifth lumbar vertebra and the sacral segment. So, here we have the lumbosacral joint. It comes under the classification of secondary cartilaginous joint. It also has the facet joint which comes under the plane variety. The articular structures are the inferior articular surface of the fifth lumbar vertebra articulates with the superior articular surface of the sacral vertebra. Then the facet joints will have the articular surface of inferior articular facet and superior articular facets. Then comes the ligaments. We have so many ligaments: iliolumbar ligament, anterior longitudinal ligament, posterior longitudinal ligament, ligamentum flavum, posterior longitudinal ligament, interspinous ligament and supraspinous ligament. These are the different ligaments present at the L5 to S1 junction and also at the facet junction. Next, the blood supply is through the iliolumbar arteries, lateral sacral arteries and medial sacral artery. This joint receives the nerve supply from L5 to S1 and the movements are flexion, extension and minimal degree of lateral flexion, and also it plays a very important role in transferring the load from the spine to the pelvis. And comes the facet joint. This joint has a limited movement which helps in flexion and extension of the lumbar spine. Next, we will move on to the sacroiliac joint. This sacroiliac joint is primarily classified as a synovial type joint and which is more fibrous in nature. The sacroiliac joint permits slight motion and it is one of the most essential weight bearing joints. This is the sacroiliac joint. The ala of the sacrum articulates with the ilium. So, this is the synovial joint and the auricular surfaces of ilium articulates with the auricular surface of the sacrum. These are the ligaments. We have anterior sacroiliac ligament, posterior sacroiliac ligament, sacrotuberous ligament and sacrospinous ligament. And this joint receives the nerve supply from S1 to S2 spinal nerves, superior gluteal nerve, obturator nerve, and also it receives branches from the lumbosacral trunk. Then we have the blood supply through the iliolumbar, superior gluteal, lateral sacral arteries. And these are the movements at the sacroiliac joint. It has a very limited movement. It has only sliding, gliding and rotatory movements. Next, we will move on to the sacrococcygeal joint, which is nothing but junction between the apex of the sacrum towards the coccyx. This joint comes under the category of cartilaginous joint, which is known as the symphysis. The articular surfaces are the facet for coccyx, which is the apex of the sacrum, and then the articular surfaces are the apex of the sacrum and the articular facet of the coccyx. Then we have the ligaments: anterior sacrococcygeal ligament, superior posterior coccygeal ligament, deep posterior sacrococcygeal ligament, lateral sacrococcygeal ligament and intercorneal ligaments. We receive the blood supply through the lateral sacral arteries and medial sacral artery. Then the nerve supply is through the spinal nerves from S4 to S5, and this sacrococcygeal joint has a very limited movement. It has only slight passive flexion and extension of coccyx. It especially occurs during the labor. On summary, we have seen the different joints from the cervical level till the sacral level. These are the different joints present throughout the entire vertebral column. Thank you for watching.